The evening of August 7th, 1943, settled over the small town of Bamber Bridge in Lancashire, England, with a gentle summer warmth that brought residents out to their gardens and corner shops. At precisely 1800 hours, a convoy of United States Army trucks rumbled down Station Road, carrying members of the 713th Tank Destroyer Battalion, a segregated African-American unit recently stationed at the nearby military camp. The soldiers, weary from another day of intense training exercises, looked forward to the simple pleasure of an evening pint at the Ye Olde Hob Inn, a centuries-old establishment that had become their refuge from the rigid segregation they faced, even thousands of kilometers from home. What these men could not have known as they descended from their vehicles in their crisp olive uniforms was that this ordinary Tuesday evening would ignite a confrontation that would force an entire community to choose sides and create a moment that would echo through history as one of the most remarkable stands against injustice during the entire conflict. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the account of how a simple pub owner's defiance would transform a quiet English village into the stage for a battle over dignity that neither army brass nor ingrained prejudice could suppress. Private First Class James Walker had been in England for 3 months, and in that time he had discovered something that felt almost like freedom. Back home in Alabama, he could not drink from the same water fountain as white citizens, could not sit in the front of a bus, could not look a white woman in the eye without risking his life. The humiliation had been constant and total, woven into every moment of every day. He remembered the time his mother had been forced to step into a muddy ditch to let a white woman pass on the sidewalk, remembered watching his father address white men half his age as sir while they called him boy, remembered the terror of accidentally brushing against a white child in a store and seeing the murderous rage bloom in adult eyes around him. That was the world he had known for 23 years, a world where his humanity was negotiable, where his life could be forfeit for the smallest perceived transgression. Here, in this rain-soaked corner of England, the local population treated him and his fellow soldiers with a respect that felt revolutionary. Children waved at them on the streets, genuinely excited to see the American soldiers, making no distinction between the white troops stationed elsewhere and Walker's black battalion. Shopkeepers served them without hesitation, without the subtle hostility that had marked every commercial transaction in Alabama, without making them wait while white customers were served first, without the contemptuous indifference that had communicated their lesser status. Women spoke to them as equals, looked them in the eye, laughed at their jokes, without fear that such familiarity would be interpreted as sexual invitation and provoke white violence. And the landlord of Ye Olde Hob Inn, a stout man named Arthur Pickup, welcomed them with the same hearty greeting he offered every patron. Walker would never forget the first time he had walked through that heavy wooden door, his shoulders tense with anticipation of rejection, his mind already preparing for the humiliation of being turned away. Pickup had looked up from the pint he was pulling, seen Walker standing uncertainly in the doorway, and boomed out in his thick Lancashire accent, "Well, come in then, lad. Do not just stand there letting the cold air in. What can I get you?" Not what do you want, not a suspicious interrogation of his right to be there, just the simple question of what he would like to drink, as if his presence was unremarkable, as if he was just another customer deserving of service. Walker stood now at the polished oak bar, nursing a pint of bitter that tasted nothing like the beer back home, listening to his friend Corporal David Harris describe a letter from his wife in Chicago. Harris had tears in his eyes as he read portions aloud, his wife's words describing their infant daughter's first attempts at crawling, her first tooth, her first word which had been Dada, even though her father was 5,000 kilometers away across an ocean. The other soldiers listened with quiet attention, each man carrying his own homesickness, his own longing for families left behind, his own uncertainty about whether he would survive to see his children grow. The pub was full but not crowded, perhaps 40 souls scattered among the dark wooden tables and settees that had occupied this space since before America was even a nation. The building dated back to 1726, its oak beams still solid, its stone floor worn smooth by centuries of boots, its walls absorbing the conversations and laughter of generations. Walker found something comforting in this antiquity, This sense that his presence here was part of a continuity stretching back through time, that this pub had welcomed travelers and soldiers and working people for over 200 years and saw no reason to stop now, just because some of those soldiers had brown skin. The air hung thick with tobacco smoke and the yeast-sweet smell of beer, punctuated by bursts of laughter and the clink of glass on wood. A wireless in the corner played Glenn Miller's orchestra, the music weaving through conversations in accents Walker had learned to distinguish, the flat vowels of Lancashire, mixing with the varied dialects of his own unit, men from Georgia and New York, Texas and Pennsylvania, all united by the color of their skin and the uniform on their backs. The music was in the mood, that infectious swing rhythm that made even the most hardened soldiers tap their feet, that reminded them all of a world beyond military discipline and racial hatred, a world of dance halls and romance and simple joy. At a corner table, 3 local women sat with soldiers from the battalion, sharing stories and laughter that came easily after 3 pints. One of them, a factory worker named Mary, was teaching Private Robert Johnson how to properly pronounce Worcestershire, dissolving into giggles each time his southern accent mangled the syllables. Johnson, who came from rural Mississippi and had never traveled more than 80 kilometers from his birthplace before joining the army, was utterly charmed by this English woman, with her practical manner and easy laugh, by the fact that she treated him as a man worth teaching, worth talking to, worth spending time with. Watching them, Walker felt a pang of something that might have been envy or might have been hope. Johnson was courting Mary, or Mary was courting Johnson, the traditional gender roles made ambiguous by the cultural distance between them, by the fact that Johnson had no template for how an honorable courtship with a white woman might proceed, because such a thing had been literally unthinkable in the world he came from. In Mississippi, a black man looking at a white woman with interest could be lynched. Here, Mary touched Johnson's hand when she laughed, leaned close to him when the music played, looked at him with an affection that was unmistakable and apparently unremarkable to everyone around them. This easy camaraderie, this simple human connection, was precisely what worried the white American military police, who had been watching the year-old Hob Inn with growing concern for weeks. The MPs had filed reports about the fraternization between British women and Negro troops, about the breakdown of proper racial boundaries, about the dangerous example being set for black soldiers who might return to America with expectations of continued equality. The military police saw what was happening in Bamber Bridge not as friendship, but as a threat to the racial order they were committed to maintaining, a virus of equality that had to be contained before it spread. The door swung open at 1845 hours, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. 3 white American MPs entered, their white helmets and armbands stark against their uniforms, faces set in expressions of rigid authority. The tallest of them, a sergeant from Mississippi named Bradford, surveyed the room with evident distaste. Behind them, 2 more MPs waited outside, hands resting on their holstered sidearms. Sergeant Bradford approached the bar where Arthur Pickup stood drying glasses with a threadbare towel. Bradford was a large man, over 190 centimeters tall, with a jaw that looked carved from granite and eyes that had never learned to smile. He had spent his entire adult life in a world where the natural order placed him above men like Walker and Harris, and the sight of them drinking freely, laughing with white women, sitting as equals in this establishment, offended him in a way that made his hands curl into fists. The music still played, but conversations had begun to fade, replaced by a watchful silence. Walker felt his stomach tighten. He had seen this before, this particular strain of confrontation, back in training camps in Texas and Louisiana. It always started the same way, with white MPs deciding that black soldiers were getting too comfortable, forgetting their place. Then Bradford spoke, his voice carrying across the pub. "Mr. Pickup, I am here on official United States Army business. I am informing you that this establishment is now off limits to colored troops, effective immediately. You will ask these men to leave and refuse them service in the future." The sergeant placed a printed order on the bar, the paper crisp and official, bearing the seal of the United States Army. Arthur Pickup was 58 years old, a veteran of the First World War where he had seen horrors that still visited him in dreams. He had fought at Passchendaele, had spent 3 days trapped in a flooded shell crater with 2 wounded comrades watching them slowly die, because no stretcher bearers could reach them through the artillery barrage. He had watched 18-year-old boys from his own town, cut down by machine gun fire, had survived a gas attack that left him coughing blood for months, had come home in 1918 with shrapnel still embedded in his left leg that ached when it rained. He had been running Ye Olde Hob Inn for 22 years, had served miners and farmers, travellers and soldiers, had buried 2 children in infancy, and nursed his wife through pneumonia that nearly took her in 1936. His hands were scarred from pulling pints and scrubbing floors, his back permanently bent from years of hauling barrels up from the cellar, his face lined with the accumulated weariness of a hard life lived without complaint. He was not an educated man, had left school at age 12 to work in the cotton mills when his father died, had never read a book that was not the Bible, had never travelled beyond Lancashire, except for his military service, but he possessed a quality that Bradford had never encountered in his privileged southern upbringing, an absolute moral clarity about right and wrong that could not be intimidated or bought. Pickup had seen enough death to know that all men bled the same colour, had shared trenches with men of every background, and learned that courage and cowardice knew no boundaries of class or race, had been saved by a Jewish medic and an Irish sergeant and a Welsh miner, and learned that decency was not the exclusive property of any one group. The idea that these young black soldiers, who were training to face dangers he remembered all too vividly, should be denied service in his pub because of their skin colour struck him as not just wrong but obscene, a perversion of the values he thought they were all supposed to be fighting for. Pickup looked at the order, then at Bradford, then at the roomful of soldiers who had become his friends over these past months, men who had helped him repair his roof after a storm, who had spent their meagre pay in his pub keeping his business alive, who had treated his daughter with respect and his establishment with care, men who were training to cross the Channel and face dangers that Bradford, with his safe posting harassing his own troops, would never confront. The landlord picked up the order, held it for a long moment, then tore it precisely in half. The ripping sound seemed impossibly loud in the silent pub, a sound that carried finality and defiance in equal measure. He tore it again and again until the official United States Army directive was nothing but confetti in his weathered hands, the insignia and official seals reduced to meaningless fragments. He let the pieces fall onto the bar like snow, watching them settle among the beer rings and damp spots. Treating the military order with the same regard, he might give a losing betting slip. "The sergeant is welcome to leave my establishment," Pickup said, his Lancashire accent thick with contempt, each word carefully chosen and delivered with the weight of absolute conviction. "But these lads," he gestured to Walker, Harris, Johnson, and the others, his hand sweeping across the soldiers who had come to mean something to him over these months, "these lads are welcome here any time they choose to come. They have treated my pub with respect, treated my customers with courtesy, paid their tabs without complaint, and behaved as perfect gentlemen. This is England, Sergeant, not Mississippi. In my pub, I serve who I bloody well please, and I please to serve these fine soldiers who are here to help us win this conflict. Now I suggest you take yourself and your ignorance out that door before I have you removed." The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to take back, revolutionary in their defiance of American military authority. Pickup felt his heart hammering in his chest, felt the old shrapnel wound in his leg throbbing, felt 22 years of careful neutrality as a publican dissolving in this moment of taking sides. He knew there would be consequences, knew that angering the Americans could cost him their business, could possibly even cost him his license if they pressured the local authorities, could mark him as a troublemaker in a war where cooperation with the Allies was considered patriotic duty. But looking at these young black soldiers, seeing in their faces the same mixture of hope and fear he had seen in the mirrors of the trenches, he found he did not care about the consequences. For perhaps 5 seconds nothing happened. Bradford stood frozen, his face cycling through shock, rage and disbelief. No civilian had ever spoken to him this way, certainly no civilian in occupied territory dependent on American goodwill and American dollars. The concept that his authority could be questioned, that his orders could be rejected, seemed to short-circuit something fundamental in his understanding of the world. Then the pub erupted. Every British citizen in the establishment, perhaps 25 men and women, stood as one. The 3 factory workers at the corner table moved to stand beside the black soldiers. Old Tom Barnsley, who had lost both sons at Dunkirk, positioned himself between Bradford and the bar. 2 other locals, young men exempt from service due to their work in essential industries, flanked the doorway, blocking the exit. "You heard Mr. Pickup," Tom Barnsley said, his voice shaking slightly but firm. "These American lads are guests in our country and friends in our town. If anyone is leaving, it is you and your bullies. This is our home, and we decide who is welcome here." Bradford's hand moved toward his sidearm, an instinctive gesture that proved to be a catastrophic mistake. Before his fingers touched the holster, 6 black soldiers had moved between him and the civilians, their faces calm but their bodies coiled with readiness. These were men trained in combat, men who had endured a lifetime of humiliation and violence, men who had finally found a place where they were treated as human beings, and they were not about to surrender it without a fight. Walker found himself standing shoulder to shoulder with Harris and Johnson, facing down the MPs with a clarity of purpose he had never felt before. His hands were steady, his breathing calm, his mind clear of the fog of fear that usually accompanied confrontations with white authority. For the first time in his 23 years, he was not alone. For the first time in his life, white people were standing with him, not against him, were risking something real to defend his dignity, were choosing him over the comfortable solidarity of racial privilege. The realization was so powerful, it made his eyes burn, made something catch in his throat that he had to swallow down hard. He thought of his mother back in Alabama, thought of her bent back and quiet endurance, of the way she had taught him to survive by making himself small and invisible, by never challenging, never protesting, never expecting anything better. He thought of his father's humiliation, the way that good man had spent 50 years being called boy by white teenagers, had accepted insults and degradation, because resistance meant death. He thought of his sister, who cleaned white people's houses for pennies while they complained about her work and accused her of theft. He thought of every moment of casual cruelty, every degradation, large and small, that had defined his existence in Alabama. And he stood here in this English pub, with white people defending him. It was so far outside his experience that it felt almost unreal, like a dream that would shatter, when Bradford reasserted the racial order that was supposed to govern all human interaction. But it did not shatter. The British civilians held their ground, their faces set with determination, their bodies positioned between the black soldiers and the MPs in a physical manifestation of solidarity that moved Walker more than he could express. "I suggest you remove your hand from that weapon, Sergeant," Arthur Pickup said quietly. "You are outnumbered, you are in the wrong, and if you think I will not have every person in this pub testify that you drew a weapon on unarmed civilians and soldiers enjoying a peaceful evening, you are very much mistaken. The local constabulary knows me well. I wonder if your superiors will appreciate the international incident you are about to create." Bradford's hand slowly moved away from his sidearm. His face had gone from red to a mottled purple, veins standing out on his forehead. This was not how this was supposed to proceed. The order was clear. The segregation policies that governed every American military installation were supposed to extend to British establishments. He had done this before in other towns, delivered these orders, watched as pub owners reluctantly complied, witnessed black soldiers shuffled back to their segregated quarters. That was the natural order. That was how the world worked. "This is not over," Bradford said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Your establishment will be declared off-limits to all United States personnel. You will lose every penny of American business. And these soldiers," he pointed at Walker and the others, "these soldiers will face disciplinary action for refusing a direct order from a military policeman. Mark my words, there will be consequences for this defiance." "Then create your consequences," Arthur Pickup replied, already turning back to the bar, dismissing Bradford as if he were nothing more than a troublesome drunk. "But do it elsewhere. You are no longer welcome in my pub." The MPs left, but the door had barely closed behind them, when Walker realized that everyone in the pub was looking at the black soldiers with expressions of concern. Arthur Pickup poured 7 pints of his best bitter, placing them on the bar. "On the house, lads," he said quietly. And I meant what I said. You are welcome here, always, regardless of what some jumped-up sergeant thinks about the matter. This is our town, our pub, and we stand by our friends. Mary, the factory worker who had been teaching Johnson to pronounce Worcestershire, spoke up, her voice carrying clearly, "We have seen what you boys have dealt with from your own MPs. We have watched them harass you, follow you, try to enforce their bigotry on our streets. It is shameful. You are here to help us, and we will not stand by and watch you be treated like criminals for the color of your skin. This is not what we are about." The evening continued, but the atmosphere had changed. The easy laughter was gone, replaced by a tense awareness that something had shifted, that a line had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. Walker and his friends stayed another hour, but their enjoyment was muted by the knowledge that Bradford's threat was not empty. There would be consequences, and those consequences would likely fall hardest on them. They were right to worry. At 2200 hours that night, as the last patrons left Ye Old Hob Inn, a staff car arrived at the 713th Tank Destroyer Battalion's camp. Lieutenant Colonel George Henley, the white commanding officer, emerged with a face like thunder and a written order from the Regional American Military Command. Effective immediately, all establishments in Bamber Bridge were declared off-limits to Negro troops. Any soldier found violating this order would face court-martial for disobeying a direct command. The order was to be posted in every barracks and read aloud at morning formation. But the order had an unintended effect. When it was read the following morning to the assembled battalion, the response was not compliance but outrage. These men had been training for months to go into active duty, had been told repeatedly that they were fighting for freedom and democracy, had been shown propaganda films about the evils of the German regime of that era and their ideology of racial superiority. The irony of being subjected to their own system of racial segregation while preparing to confront another nation's racism was not lost on them. Corporal David Harris stood in formation that morning, August 8th, listening to his company commander stumble through the order and felt something break inside him. He had left his wife and infant daughter in Chicago, had volunteered for service believing that military service might earn him and his people a measure of respect, had endured months of abuse from white officers and MPs who saw his uniform as an insult to their racial hierarchy. And now, after finally finding a community that treated him as an equal, that small dignity was being stripped away by men who claimed to represent freedom. After the formation was dismissed, Harris walked to the barracks he shared with 17 other men. The room was thick with anger and frustration. Private Johnson sat on his bunk, head in his hands. Walker stood by the window, staring out at the English countryside that had briefly felt like home. Sergeant William Thompson, a veteran of 3 years in the segregated army, paced the narrow aisle between bunks, his usually calm demeanor replaced by barely controlled fury. "They cannot do this," Thompson said, though everyone knew they could and had. "They cannot tell an English publican who to serve in his own establishment. This is not Georgia, this is not Alabama. These people welcomed us, treated us like men, and now we are supposed to abandon them because some racist sergeants cannot stand to see us happy. What choice do we have?" another soldier asked quietly. "You heard the order. Court-martial for disobedience. That means the stockade, dishonorable discharge, maybe even time in a federal prison. We have families depending on our pay, our service records. What are we supposed to do?" The question hung in the air unanswered, because there was no good answer. The system was designed to give them no choice, to force compliance through the threat of destroying their futures, their families, their very lives. It was the same mechanism that had kept Black Americans in subjugation for centuries, the threat of overwhelming force if they dared to step out of line. But something had changed in these men during their time in Bamber Bridge. They had tasted equality, had experienced what it felt like to walk into a pub and be greeted as a friend rather than a threat, had seen their humanity reflected in the eyes of people who judged them by their character rather than their color. They had discovered that the degradation they experienced was not natural or inevitable, but a choice, a deliberate system maintained by people who benefited from their subordination. And having discovered this, they found they could not simply accept returning to their previous state of humiliation. That evening, In direct violation of the newly posted order, nearly 40 soldiers from the 713th Tank Destroyer Battalion walked into Bamber Bridge. They did not go to Ye Olde Hob Inn, knowing that would bring immediate retaliation against Arthur Pickup. Instead, they dispersed to other pubs and shops, testing whether the solidarity shown at the Hob Inn was isolated or genuine. They were about to receive their answer. At the White Bull pub, landlord Robert Davies greeted the first group of black soldiers with a broad smile and immediate service. At the shops along Station Road, merchants served them without hesitation. At the fish and chip shop, the owner, a widow named Elizabeth Grant, gave them extra portions and refused to accept payment from 2 soldiers who had helped her carry coal to her cellar the previous week. The message was clear. Bamber Bridge stood with their black American guests against their white American oppressors. The MPs, of course, noticed. By 1900 hours, Sergeant Bradford and a reinforced contingent of 8 military policemen were patrolling Bamber Bridge, documenting violations, preparing charges, making their presence felt as a threat and a promise. The British civilians watched this occupation of their streets with growing resentment. When Bradford entered the White Bull and demanded that Robert Davies refuse service to the black soldiers, Davies responded by buying a round for every black soldier in his establishment and telling Bradford that if he did not leave immediately, he would find himself face down in the street. The situation was escalating beyond anyone's control. At 2000 hours, Lieutenant Colonel Henley arrived in Bamber Bridge with 2 more staff cars full of white officers, attempting to order his black soldiers back to base. He found them scattered across the town, supported by a civilian population that had now fully committed to their defense. British police constables, who should have been enforcing order, stood by and watched, making it clear through their inaction where their sympathies lay. Walker stood outside the White Bull, watching this absurd theater unfold, watching white American officers try to assert authority over black American soldiers, while British civilians formed a protective barrier between them. It was surreal, like watching the entire racial hierarchy that had governed his entire life collapse into incoherence. The officers kept shouting orders, the soldiers kept ignoring them, the British kept standing firm, and nobody quite knew what happened next. What happened next was that Sergeant Bradford made a decision that would transform this standoff into something far more serious. At 21:15 hours, frustrated by the lack of compliance, embarrassed by the defiance of both the black soldiers and the British civilians, Bradford drew his sidearm and pointed it at Corporal Harris, ordering him to return to base immediately or face charges of mutiny. It was a catastrophically stupid decision, made by a man whose entire sense of self depended on maintaining a racial hierarchy that was crumbling before his eyes. Harris looked at the weapon pointed at his chest and made a choice. He did not move. He did not comply. He simply stood there looking Bradford in the eye and said quietly, "If you are going to use that, Sergeant, then use it, because I am not moving. I have done nothing wrong. I am standing on a public street in a town where I am welcome. If you want to shoot me for that, then shoot me. But I will not be ordered around like a dog anymore." For perhaps 10 seconds, nobody breathed. The entire street had gone silent, watching this confrontation, waiting to see if an American military policeman would actually shoot an American soldier for the crime of standing on a British street. In that moment, decades of racial violence hung in the balance, all the lynchings and beatings and murders that had enforced segregation in America, transplanted to this quiet Lancashire town. Bradford did not fire. His hand shook, his face contorted with rage and humiliation, but he did not fire. Perhaps he realized that shooting Harris would turn every British citizen in Bamber Bridge into an enemy. Perhaps he recognized that such an action would create an international incident that would destroy his career. Or perhaps in that moment, even he recognized that there were lines that could not be crossed, acts that could not be justified. He lowered the weapon, and in lowering it, he lost. Every soldier watching, every civilian witness, everyone in that street knew that the bluff had been called and found empty. The threat of violence that undergirded the entire system of segregation had been exposed as hollow, at least here, at least now in this specific time and place. But if Bradford had lost, Lieutenant Colonel Henley recognized that the situation was now beyond recovery. He ordered all MPs to withdraw from Bamber Bridge immediately and returned to base. He then addressed the black soldiers, his voice carefully controlled. "Gentlemen, I am requesting, not ordering, that you return to camp. I give you my word that there will be no charges filed for tonight's events. I recognize that this situation has been badly mishandled, and I will be making a full report to Regional Command. But I am asking you, for your own safety and to prevent this from escalating further, to please return to your quarters." It was Sergeant Thompson who responded, speaking for all of them. "We will return, Colonel, on the condition that the order declaring Bamber Bridge off limits is rescinded. These people have shown us more respect and dignity than we have received from our own army. We will not abandon them because some MPs cannot tolerate seeing us treated as equals. Rescind the order and we will return. Maintain it, and sir, with respect, we will remain here." Henley looked at these men, soldiers under his command, and saw something he had not seen before. He saw dignity that could not be broken, solidarity that could not be fractured, a commitment to principle that he, a white officer from Connecticut who considered himself progressive, had to admit he did not fully possess. These men were prepared to risk everything, their careers, their freedom, possibly their lives, for the simple right to be treated as human beings. "I do not have the authority to rescind that order," Henley said quietly, "but I will contact Regional Command tonight and recommend in the strongest possible terms that it be withdrawn. You have my word on that. In the meantime, I am declaring a 24-hour stand-down for this battalion. No training exercises, no duties beyond essential camp maintenance. Consider it a cooling-off period for everyone involved. It was not a victory, but it was a concession, an acknowledgement that the black soldiers had agency, that their demands had legitimacy, that they could not simply be ordered into compliance. The soldiers conferred quietly among themselves, then agreed. They would return to camp, but they had made their point. Bamber Bridge stood with them. The British civilians stood with them. And even their own white commanding officer, whatever his personal limitations, had recognized that the situation had to change. The walk back to camp that night was quiet but not defeated. 40 men moving through the darkened English countryside, each carrying the knowledge that they had stood up and not been struck down, that they had demanded respect and not been destroyed for the audacity of that demand. It was not freedom, not yet, but it was something, a crack in the wall that had confined them their entire lives. What they did not know, could not have known, was that Arthur Pickup had been busy during the standoff. The moment the MPs had withdrawn, he had walked to the local post office and placed a telephone call to the headquarters of the American Red Cross in London. He had then called a friend who worked for the Manchester Guardian newspaper. He had called the local member of Parliament. He had set in motion a chain of communications that would, within 48 hours, reach the desk of the American ambassador to the United Kingdom. The report that landed on the ambassador's desk on August 10th made for uncomfortable reading. A detailed account of American military police attempting to enforce segregation in British establishments, of threats made against British civilians, of a weapon drawn on an American soldier for the crime of standing on a public street. Worse, the report included statements from over 30 British citizens, all respectable members of their community, all testifying to the exemplary behavior of the black American soldiers and the shameful conduct of the white MPs and officers. The ambassador, a skilled diplomat who understood that America's relationship with Britain was the cornerstone of the entire Allied effort, recognized immediately that this could not be allowed to fester. American military policy was American business, but attempting to export American segregation to British soil created diplomatic complications that could undermine the entire alliance. He placed a call to the commanding general of American forces in the United Kingdom. The order declaring Bamber Bridge off limits to Negro troops was rescinded on August 11, 1943, 72 hours after it had been posted. Sergeant Bradford and 2 other MPs were quietly transferred to a base in Scotland, far from any concentration of black troops. Lieutenant Colonel Henley received a commendation for his handling of a difficult situation, though the private reprimand in his personnel file noted his initial failure to recognize the injustice of the segregation order. And the 713th Tank Destroyer Battalion returned to Ye Olde Hob Inn on August 12th, greeted by Arthur Pickup with free pints and a reception that felt like a homecoming. But the story was not over. The events in Bamber Bridge had revealed something that American military command found deeply troubling. They had discovered that British civilians would not support American segregation policies, that they would actively resist attempts to impose such policies on British soil, that they saw the treatment of black American soldiers as fundamentally incompatible with the democratic values the Allies claimed to be fighting for. This created a serious problem because the American military was planning to station hundreds of thousands of troops in Britain in preparation for the eventual invasion of Europe, and a significant portion of those troops would be black. The solution, worked out over several months of negotiation between American and British authorities, was an unspoken compromise. American bases would remain segregated, as was American military policy. But off-base, in British towns and pubs and shops, the British would serve whoever they chose to serve, and American MPs would not interfere. It was not equality, but it was a space where black soldiers could experience something approaching normal human dignity, a few hours each week where they were not defined entirely by their race. For the men of the 713th Tank Destroyer Battalion, this compromise meant that their remaining months in England took on a quality that many would later describe as the freest period of their lives. They trained during the day under white officers, who treated them with varying degrees of respect or contempt, learning the technical skills of operating and maintaining their tank destroyers, mastering the tactics of mobile defensive operations, preparing for the active duty that would eventually take them across the Channel into the heart of the European conflict. The training was hard, the discipline strict, the segregation on base absolute and humiliating. But in the evenings and on weekends they walked into Bamber Bridge as welcome guests, as friends, as men. The transformation from base to town was so dramatic it felt like crossing into a different world, like shedding the degrading identity imposed by military segregation and reclaiming their humanity. On base, they were colored troops, a designation that carried contempt and limitation, that defined them primarily by what they were not allowed to do, where they were not allowed to go, who they were not allowed to be. In Bamber Bridge, they were simply American soldiers, individuals with names and personalities and stories, people worthy of respect and friendship and dignified treatment. Walker became a regular at Yeolde Hob Inn, learning to play darts with a precision that made the locals groan good-naturedly when he approached the board. He had never played darts before England, had never even seen the game, but discovered he had a natural talent for it, an ability to calculate angles and distances that served him well both in sport and in his eventual combat operations. The local dart players adopted him, taught him the finer points of the game, included him in their Friday night tournaments, treated his victories and defeats with the same enthusiasm they showed for their own. Through darts, Walker formed friendships that taught him what normal social interaction felt like, what it meant to compete and joke and argue without the constant underlying threat of racial violence. He learned the local dialect, picked up expressions and phrases that marked him as an honorary Lancastrian, developed running jokes with specific individuals that created bonds of genuine affection. Old Tom Barnsley, who had stood between him and Bradford that first night, became something like a father figure, offering advice on everything from dart technique to matters of the heart, treating Walker with a respect his own father had never been allowed to show in public. Harris joined a local football club and discovered a talent for the game that earned him genuine admiration, his speed and agility making him a formidable player despite his limited experience with association football. Back home, organized sports had been segregated, the idea of black athletes competing with or against whites considered inappropriate and dangerous. Here he played alongside Englishmen who cared only about his ability to score goals and prevent the opposition from scoring, who judged him on his performance rather than his race, who celebrated his victories and commiserated with his defeats as teammates should. Johnson fell in love with Mary, the factory worker who had taught him to pronounce Worcestershire, and though military regulations forbade marriage to foreign nationals, they spent every possible moment together, creating memories that would sustain them through the long separation to come. The battalion shipped out in March 1944, part of the massive build-up for the invasion of Europe. They landed on the beaches of southern France in August 1944, fighting their way through the German defensive lines, operating their tank destroyers with a skill and courage that earned them a unit citation. 12 men from the battalion were lost in action between August and December 1944. Another 23 were wounded. They were black men fighting for a country that did not treat them as equals, defending a democracy they were not fully allowed to participate in, and they did it with honor and sacrifice that shamed the nation they served. Arthur Pickup kept every letter he received from the soldiers he had befriended. Walker wrote to him from France, describing the conflict, but also remembering quiet evenings at the pub, the taste of bitter, the warmth of genuine friendship. Harris wrote from Germany in early 1945, thanking Pickup for showing him what respect felt like, for giving him something to survive for. Thompson wrote from Belgium, sharing the news that Johnson had been wounded but would recover, and asking Pickup to look after Mary until Johnson could return. The conflict ended in May 1945, but most of the black soldiers did not return to England. They were shipped directly back to America, to a country that greeted their service with continued segregation, discrimination, and violence. The men who had fought for democracy abroad came home to poll taxes and literacy tests that denied them the vote, to schools and restaurants and neighborhoods they were forbidden to enter, to a GI Bill that was systematically denied to black veterans through bureaucratic discrimination. Walker returned to Alabama, where he was beaten by local police for wearing his uniform in public, the sight of a black man in military dress considered an act of insolence by whites who had never served. Harris went back to Chicago, where he found that the factory job he had been promised was not available, that the union would not admit black workers, that the medals on his chest meant nothing to employers who would not hire him. Thompson settled in New York, where he joined the growing civil rights movement, carrying with him the memory of Bamber Bridge, the proof that racism was not inevitable, that people could choose differently. Johnson did return to Bamber Bridge in 1946, crossing the Atlantic on a civilian ship with his discharge papers and his savings, determined to marry Mary and build a life in the place where he had been treated as a man. They married in September 1946, Arthur Pickup standing as witness, and settled in a small house on Station Road. Johnson found work as a mechanic. Mary continued at the factory. And they raised 3 children who grew up British, but carried their father's stories of Alabama and their mother's stories of the night the town stood up to racism. Arthur Pickup continued running Ye Old Hob Inn until his death in 1961. He never spoke publicly about the events of August 1943, considering his actions unremarkable, the basic requirement of decency. When a local newspaper tried to interview him in 1958 for an article about the American military presence during the conflict, he declined, saying simply that he had served soldiers who deserved to be served, and there was nothing more to say about it. But in Bamber Bridge, the story was never forgotten. The older generation told it to the younger, parents to children, teachers to students. It became part of the town's identity, a moment when their community had faced a choice and chosen correctly, when ordinary people had stood against injustice despite the risk. A plaque was placed on the wall of Ye Old Hob Inn in 1984, commemorating the friendship between the town and the 713th Tank Destroyer Battalion, honoring Arthur Pickup's courage, remembering a moment when the color bar broke, if only temporarily, if only in one small town. The broader impact of Bamber Bridge extended far beyond that single town. Reports of the incident circulated among black soldiers throughout the European theater, becoming a legend of resistance, proof that dignity could be defended, that white supremacy was not invincible. It contributed to a growing consciousness among black servicemen that their treatment was not natural or inevitable, but a political choice that could be challenged and changed. When these soldiers returned home after the conflict ended, they brought with them the memory of places like Bamber Bridge, the experience of being treated as equals, the knowledge that racism was not universal but specific, not eternal but temporal. They became the generation that launched the modern civil rights movement, that demanded the democracy they had fought for, that refused to accept continued subjugation after having proven their courage and capability. The connection between military service and civil rights activism was not accidental but direct, forged in moments like the stand at Ye Olde Hob Inn. Historians studying this period have noted that the American military's experience in Britain created significant problems for maintaining segregation. British civilians consistently rejected American attempts to impose racial separation, creating spaces where black soldiers could experience integration and equality. This experience radicalized many black soldiers and made it impossible for the American military to maintain the fiction that segregation was natural or accepted. The contradictions became unsustainable, contributing to President Truman's decision in 1948 to desegregate the American military, one of the first major victories of the civil rights era. The town of Bamber Bridge itself changed little in the decades after the conflict. It remained a small Lancashire community, its economy built on agriculture and small industry, its population steady, its character unchanged. But it carried the knowledge that it had been part of something larger, that in a moment that mattered, its people had chosen justice over expedience, solidarity over submission. That knowledge shaped the town's identity, creating a tradition of tolerance and fairness that persisted through generations. Mary and Robert Johnson raised their children with stories of both America and England, of racism and resistance, of the night an entire town stood up against injustice. Their eldest son became a teacher, dedicating his career to education about civil rights and social justice. Their daughter worked for the Commission for Racial Equality, fighting discrimination in employment and housing. Their youngest child became a historian, eventually writing the definitive account of the Bamber Bridge incident, ensuring that the story would not be lost to time. In America, the veterans of the 713th Tank Destroyer Battalion scattered across the country, most returning to the segregated South or the de facto segregated North, most facing continued discrimination despite their service. But they maintained connections, writing letters, attending reunions, sharing memories of England and Bamber Bridge and the time they were treated as men. Those memories sustained them through the long struggle for civil rights, through the marches and sit-ins and voter registration drives, through the violence and setbacks and small victories that slowly, painfully transformed America. Walker became a postal worker in Montgomery, Alabama, where he watched Rosa Parks refuse to give up her seat on a bus in 1955 and recognized the same spirit he had seen in Corporal Harris refusing to back down when Bradford drew his weapon. He joined the Montgomery bus boycott, walking to work every day for over a year, drawing on the strength he had learned in England, the knowledge that dignity was worth defending. He lived to see the Civil Rights Act of 1964 pass, died in 1998, and was buried with his military honors and his memories of a pub in Lancashire, where he had been welcomed as an equal. Harris returned to Chicago, worked in a steel mill after being denied better employment, raised 4 children, marched with Martin Luther King Jr. in 1966, survived the turbulent decades of American racial conflict with his dignity intact and his memories of England vivid. He visited Bamber Bridge twice, in 1971 and 1989, was welcomed by people who remembered or had heard the stories, stood at Arthur Pickup's grave and wept for the man who had defended him when his own country would not. He died in 2003, surrounded by children and grandchildren who carried his stories forward. Thompson moved to New York, became a labor organizer, fought for integrated unions, used his military experience to demand respect from white workers who thought they could dismiss him. He helped organize the March on Washington in 1963, stood in that enormous crowd listening to King speak of dreams, and remembered a smaller crowd in a British pub standing up for the same principles. He died in 1978, his obituary noting his military service and his civil rights work, but saying nothing of Bamber Bridge, that story being too small for newspapers, but too important to forget. The contemporary significance of the Bamber Bridge incident lies not in its immediate impact, which was limited, but in what it represented. It demonstrated that racism was not universal, that white people could choose solidarity over supremacy, that ordinary people could resist injustice when institutions enforced it. It proved that the segregation Black Americans experienced was not inevitable or natural, but a specific political and social choice that could be rejected and opposed. The incident also highlighted the contradiction at the heart of the Allied effort in the Second World War. The Allied nations claimed to be fighting for democracy and freedom against the totalitarian ideology of the German regime of that era, Yet they maintained their own systems of racial oppression. This contradiction was not lost on colonized peoples around the world, on Black Americans, on anyone paying attention to the gap between Allied rhetoric and Allied reality. The conflict against the German regime delegitimized ideologies of racial superiority everywhere, making it increasingly difficult for the Allies to maintain their own racial hierarchies. Arthur Pickup's decision to tear up the segregation order and defend his black customers was not heroic in the conventional sense. He did not face enemy action, did not risk his life in dramatic fashion, did not perform acts of extraordinary courage. He simply refused to participate in an injustice, made a choice that should have been unremarkable but was revolutionary in its context, stood by his principles when pressured to abandon them. That is the most important kind of heroism, the everyday refusal to cooperate with evil, the ordinary person saying no to extraordinary injustice. The British civilians who supported the black soldiers were not motivated by abstract political ideology or sophisticated understanding of American racial dynamics. They were motivated by direct human contact, by friendships formed, by the simple recognition that the men they knew personally were being treated unjustly. This suggests something important about combating racism, that personal relationships, direct human connection, can break through ideological conditioning and create solidarity across racial lines. The black soldiers who stood their ground in Bamber Bridge were not seeking to start a civil rights movement or make a political statement. They were simply insisting on the basic human dignity that had been denied them their entire lives, refusing to surrender the small space of equality they had found in this English town. Their courage came not from ideology, but from experience, from having tasted respect and finding they could not return to degradation, from having seen that another way was possible. The American military's response to Bamber Bridge, quietly rescinding the segregation order while maintaining segregation on base, represented the kind of compromise that characterized racial progress throughout this era. It was not justice, but a reduction in injustice, not equality, but a small space of semi-equality, not transformation, but modification. Yet even these limited concessions mattered, creating spaces where black soldiers could experience something approaching normal life, building the foundation for future demands for full equality. The long-term impact of incidents like Bamber Bridge extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. The stories spread, the legends grew, the proof that resistance was possible and that white allies existed became part of the collective knowledge of black Americans. This knowledge fueled the civil rights movement, providing evidence that racism could be challenged, that white supremacy was not invincible, that change was possible. The direct line from Bamber Bridge to Montgomery to Selma to the Civil Rights Act may not be traceable in documents, but it exists in the consciousness of people who learned that dignity was worth fighting for. Today, Bamber Bridge remembers. The plaque on Ye Olde Hob Inn remains, though the pub itself has changed ownership multiple times. The town holds occasional commemorations, bringing together historians, descendants of the soldiers, local residents who remember the stories their grandparents told. The incident is taught in local schools as part of regional history, ensuring that new generations know the story. It is not a major historical event in the grand sweep of the Second World War, but it is their event, their moment, their town's contribution to the long struggle for human dignity. The families of the soldiers involved have maintained connections to Bamber Bridge across generations. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the 713th Tank Destroyer Battalion have visited the town, walked the streets their ancestors walked, drunk in the pubs where their ancestors were welcomed, touched the plaque that remembers. These visits create living links between past and present, ensuring that the story remains not just history but memory, not just fact but meaning. The lesson of Bamber Bridge, if there is one, is that ordinary people can make extraordinary choices, that institutions do not have to be obeyed when they enforce injustice, that solidarity across racial lines is possible when people choose to see each other's humanity. It is a lesson that remains relevant, a story that speaks to contemporary struggles, a reminder that the fight for dignity and equality is continuous, that every generation must decide whether to uphold or challenge the systems of oppression they inherit. Arthur Pickup tore up a piece of paper, and in doing so, tore at the fabric of segregation. The British civilians of Bamber Bridge stood with black soldiers, and in doing so stood for a principle that their own government did not fully honor. The soldiers of the 713th Tank Destroyer Battalion refused to accept degradation, and in doing so claimed their humanity. These were not grand gestures but simple choices, not heroic acts but basic decency, not exceptional behavior but the minimum requirement of justice. Yet in a world structured by injustice, basic decency becomes revolutionary, simple choices become momentous, the minimum requirement of justice becomes exceptional. The story of Bamber Bridge is ultimately a story about choice, about the daily decisions people make to either uphold or resist systems of oppression, to either participate in injustice or refuse it, to either see others as fully human or accept their dehumanization. It is a story that insists that individuals matter, that small acts of resistance accumulate, that ordinary people can change history by simply refusing to cooperate with evil. It is a story that deserves to be remembered, to be told, to be learned from, because it contains truths that remain urgent and necessary, and that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.